Welcome one and all to the Ancient Journey. If you like the video, please give us a like and a share, and if you're into our content, please subscribe. It helps grow the channel and it keeps us producing these videos. Today's journey, missing in Alaska, Thomas Hale Boggs and Nick Begich. In 1972, two politicians boarded a plane in Anchorage, Alaska, never to be seen again. In what would become one of Alaska's greatest mysteries, the disappearance of Thomas Hale Boggs and Nick Begich remains a mystery to this day. Thomas Hale Boggs Sr. was a member of the U.S. House of Representatives from New Orleans, Louisiana. He was the House Majority Leader in 1972 and was the youngest member of the Warren Commission, formed to investigate the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. While a lot of politicians are crooks, Boggs seemed to be an honorable man. Early in his life, he fought to break up the power held in New Orleans by U.S. Senator Huey Pierce Long. Huey Long went by the nickname the Kingfish and had been impeached as governor of Louisiana for accusing others in his legislature of being dirty or taking bribes. Long often blurred the control between state and local politics by pushing puppet candidates for governor who would enact his policies. Louisiana was also in the midst of armed skirmishes against Long's consolidated power. Long was assassinated in 1935. Thomas Hale Boggs served in the U.S. House from 1941 to 1943 and was the youngest member of Congress at the time. When Boggs lost his re-election bid, he enlisted in the U.S. Navy and served out the remainder of World War II. There were no deferments or dodging for Boggs as he finished out his enlistment with honor. After the war, he was elected to Congress and was re-elected 13 more times. Like Thomas Boggs, Nick Begich seemed to be an honorable man. He started out as a school guidance counselor and then became school superintendent of the Fort Richardson School District in Alaska. He was then elected to the Alaska State Senate and served there for 8 years, starting in 1970. On October 16, 1972, Thomas Boggs, Nick Begich, pilot Don Jones, and Russell Brown, Nick's aide, boarded a Cessna 310 to begin campaigning for Nick Begich's re-elections bid. The flight was to be from Anchorage to Juneau to a campaign fundraiser and was to take about 3.5 hours. The four men and the Cessna were never seen again. The flight took place at 9 a.m. and the weather was reasonably calm. The pilot, Don Jones, was an experienced pilot in Alaska. There was little explanation as to what happened. After 39 days, all searches were called off and the four men were declared dead on December 29, 1972. No wreckage of any kind was ever found. But as simple and cut and dry as this story seems, there are some threads left hanging that need to be tugged at. Don Jones was a very experienced pilot, but in interviews with him in years prior to the crash, he came off as overconfident and cocky. He had previously flown planes well over their weight limits, causing a forced landing in Florida, and he was described as a good guy in a tight spot, but one who didn't necessarily follow all the rules and regulations. You can disregard 99% of the BS you hear about icing, Jones was once quoted as saying. While the weather wasn't too bad on the day of the disappearance, Alaska weather is known to be quickly changing and very tricky. If the tiny Cessna had experienced icing issues, it could have spelled doom for the plane. Congressman Begich's opponents has forced to land due to heavy icing just 2 weeks prior to this event. However, there was no distress call or any radio chatter out of the ordinary ever heard from Jones or the doomed flight. The plane the four men were on was required to carry an emergency locator by Alaska law. However, no emergency signal was ever to be heard from the plane, and the reason for that is it didn't have one. Instead, the emergency locator for the Cessna was found in Fairbanks, Alaska. Some sources say in another plane. Others say it was found left behind in Don Jones' apartment. The National Transportation Safety Bureau, also known as the NTSB, had conducted an extensive investigation over the missing plane, and a witness had stated that they had seen an object that pilot Don Jones was carrying before the flight, and it appeared to be an emergency locator. In any case, it would be strange for an experienced pilot to leave the locator behind, especially with important politicians on board his flight. Another thread to pull at is Nick Begich's family life. While Nick seemed to be an honorable man, his wife Peggy seemed to be nothing of the sort. In fact, Peggy Begich would eventually marry a known mafia hitman named Jerry Max Pasley, and as it turned out, she had been dating him long before the Cessna ever took flight that day. Several known mobsters even attended their wedding. Pasley ended up in prison in 1994 for murder and made several confessions, including one about bringing a bomb to Anchorage, Alaska in 1972. He confessed his mafia contacts, who took possession of the bomb, later told him that the bomb had been placed on the doomed Cessna. Was there a mob motive behind the disappearance of Nick Begich? Or, what if Begich wasn't the target, and if it was instead Boggs? Remember, Boggs was part of the Warren Commission, who investigated the assassination of JFK. The Warren Commission had determined that Kennedy was killed by the lone gunman Lee Harvey Oswald, a notion that many did not believe at this time, and many do not to this day. There were many rumors that Boggs was one of those who did disagree and wished to reopen the investigation. Boggs claimed that after he had made this request, his life took a sudden, scary turn. He claimed he was run off the road by a black, unmarked Lincoln Continental. He claimed that the FBI was tapping his phones, and called for the resignation of then head of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover. Now, J. Edgar Hoover was not the sort of man to mess around with. But there is no way to know if any of Boggs' accusations were true. It is also important to note that Boggs' daughter, Cokie Roberts, has stated that none of these stories were true. There were also several leads on this case that seem to have never been followed up on, or were just left to die, or proved to be untrue. The FBI office in Los Angeles had received information from someone who stated they had knowledge of the plane's location, and gave the FBI its coordinates and stated 2 persons were still alive at the crash site. 2 days later, the FBI had verified the authenticity of the source, and that the source was working in a surveillance firm for an undisclosed company. But nothing ever comes of this lead, as the area is searched and nothing is found. The young Democrat who took Boggs to the airport for this trip was named William Jefferson Clinton. Years later, this president would appoint Boggs' wife Lindy as the ambassador to the Vatican. To this day, no remains of these 4 men or the doomed plane have been located. It is one of Alaska's greatest mysteries and remains so to this day. Thanks for watching, and thanks for sharing the journey.